They did not arrive with armies. No cannons thundered outside the gates of Istanbul. No flags were raised. No treaties signed after defeat on the battlefield. And yet, piece by piece, an empire was sold. Quietly, politely, legally. All it took was ink, paper, and debt. Imagine this for a moment. An empire that once dictated the fate of 3 continents now sitting across the table from foreign bankers, negotiating its own survival like a desperate gambler asking for one last loan. You are told it is modernization, progress, civilization. You are told this is how the modern world works. But buried beneath the polished language of reform is something far older and far darker: control without conquest. The 19th century did not belong to generals alone. It belonged to accountants, to bondholders, to men in London who never smelled Ottoman soil, never heard the call to prayer echo over the Bosphorus, yet slowly came to own the lifeblood of the empire itself. This is not the story of a sudden collapse. It is the story of a slow suffocation, of an empire that mortgaged its future to preserve its pride and paid for that illusion with its sovereignty. You might think this is ancient history, a relic of a forgotten world, but listen carefully, because the mechanism you are about to witness did not die with the Ottomans. It evolved, and it learned to hide in plain sight. This is the story of how Britain did not conquer the Middle East by force, but bought it, installment by installment, with interest. On the surface, the empire still shimmered. Marble palaces reflected sunlight off the Bosphorus. Silk robes brushed polished floors. Ceremonies unfolded with ancient precision, as if time itself still obeyed Istanbul. To the casual observer, the Ottoman Empire looked eternal, immovable, blessed by history. But beneath that gilded exterior, something was rotting, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. The world had changed, and the empire had not. European armies drilled with modern rifles while Ottoman troops marched with outdated muskets. Steam-powered factories roared in Manchester while Ottoman workshops struggled under guilds frozen in tradition. Railways stitched Europe together like veins of iron. While vast Ottoman territories remained fragmented, distant, and expensive to control. And money was the empire's unspoken terror. The treasury bled from endless wars, administrative excess, and a ruling class accustomed to splendor but allergic to reform. Tax collection was inefficient, corruption routine, and revenue vanished long before it could touch the lives of ordinary people. The state was large, proud, and increasingly hollow. Yet pride is a dangerous companion in an age of decline. Ottoman elites did not see themselves as falling behind. They saw themselves as temporarily inconvenienced. Europe, they believed, could be imitated, purchased, imported. Cannons could be bought. Railways ordered. Modernity shipped in crates. All it required was capital. And capital, they were assured, was abundant in the West. So a seductive idea took hold in the corridors of power. Why reform slowly and painfully when progress could be borrowed? Why dismantle old structures when money could paper over the cracks? Loans were framed not as desperation, but as destiny. The empire would modernize without humiliation. It would remain sovereign, dignified, respected. What no one said out loud was this: borrowing is never neutral. Every coin carries a shadow. Every loan remembers its owner. And every empire that confuses appearance with strength eventually learns the same lesson. The Ottomans were about to step onto a path that looked like salvation. In reality, it was a corridor with no visible exit. The first loans did not feel like a trap. They never do. They arrived wrapped in courtesy, in French and English contracts, heavy with formal respect. Smiles were exchanged. Hands were shaken. This was not conquest. This was partnership. Or so it was presented. In the early 1850s, Nuri Finsinfinsilsi far away there. Hades. As war loomed and reform was preached with growing urgency, Ottoman officials crossed a psychological line. For centuries, the empire had financed itself through its own mechanisms. Now, for the first time, it turned outward, toward European capital markets. London, Paris, the beating heart of modern finance. The message was clear. The empire wished to join the civilized world on its terms. The loans were justified as necessities. War expenses, infrastructure, railways that would bind distant provinces to the center, telegraph lines to shrink time itself, a modern army to protect imperial dignity. On paper, it all made sense. On paper, the empire was investing in its future. But paper was precisely where the danger lived. The interest rates were brutal. The discounts obscene. For every pound borrowed, far less actually reached Ottoman hands. Middlemen took their cuts. Banks deducted fees. The empire received promises at full value and cash at a fraction. The debt, however, was counted in full, merciless and exact. You have to pause here and really imagine this moment. An empire signing contracts it barely understood, written in foreign legal language, bound to repayment schedules detached from economic reality. Officials focused on survival, not sustainability. Pride prevented questions. Desperation silenced doubt. And then came the most fatal illusion of all, the belief that this was temporary, that one loan would lead to stability, that growth would outpace obligation, that the next year would be easier. Debt does not work that way. Debt feeds on optimism. It rewards denial. And as the ink dried on those early agreements, something irreversible happened. The Ottomans had not merely borrowed money. They had imported a foreign logic of power, one that did not need soldiers to advance, only time and compound interest. The door had been opened, and it would not close again. At first, the damage was invisible. That is the most dangerous phase of any financial conquest. The empire was still standing. Ceremonies continued. Diplomats spoke of reform and renewal. From a distance, nothing appeared broken. But inside the numbers, the story was already changing. The borrowed money did not behave the way salvation was supposed to. It scattered. Some vanished into corruption. Some dissolved into prestige projects designed to impress Europe rather than strengthen the state. Grand palaces rose while roads crumbled. Uniforms were updated while logistics remained medieval. Modernity became a performance, not a foundation. Meanwhile, the debt grew a life of its own. New loans were taken not to build, but to pay the interest on old ones. This is the moment when finance stops serving the state and begins to consume it. Revenues that once funded governance were quietly redirected toward creditors abroad. Taxes rose, not to improve lives, but to satisfy schedules written in London. You can almost feel the shift in gravity. Power no longer sat entirely in Istanbul. It drifted westward, into ledger books and bond markets. British financiers began to understand the empire better than its own administrators. They knew which taxes could be squeezed, which provinces produced reliable revenue, and how long the treasury could survive before begging again. And still, the illusion held. Ottoman officials reassured themselves that control remained theirs. After all, no foreign troops occupied the capital. No governor-general ruled in the Sultan's name. Flags still flew. That was enough to quiet the fear, temporarily. But debt has a rhythm. Each payment tightened the leash. Each missed target shortened it. The empire's choices narrowed, its flexibility evaporated. Every decision now carried the silent approval of unseen creditors. This was no longer about modernization. It was about survival under terms set elsewhere. And somewhere in London, far from the call to prayer and the weight of imperial tradition, men studied Ottoman finances with clinical patience. They were not waiting for collapse. They were waiting for inevitability. The trap had been set long ago. Now it was slowly, methodically, beginning to close. By the time anyone dared whisper the word crisis, it was already too late. Debt had stopped being a burden and become the environment itself, like air, unseen, inescapable, suffocating. The numbers no longer rose politely. They loomed. Interest payments consumed the treasury before a single coin could reach soldiers, teachers, or farmers. The empire was no longer governing forward. It was paying backward, forever chasing yesterday's obligations. To compensate, taxes multiplied. Not intelligently, not fairly, but desperately. Salt, tobacco, customs duties, everything that touched daily life became heavier. The peasant felt it first, then the merchant, then the provinces. Discontent spread, not as rebellion yet, but as exhaustion. The state asked more while offering less, and no one was told where the money was really going. Inside the palace, denial hardened into policy. Officials spoke of temporary pressure, of market fluctuations, of patience. New loans were negotiated with increasingly humiliating terms, yet accepted with forced smiles. Each agreement stripped away another layer of autonomy, another future decision already spent. The empire was still alive, but it was no longer steering itself. And the creditors noticed everything. They noticed missed payments, delays, accounting tricks. They noticed panic behind formal language. This was the moment when leverage becomes absolute, not through threats, but through certainty. They knew the Ottomans could not walk away. They knew time was on their side. You have to understand the cruelty of this phase. Nothing dramatic happens, no collapse, no headline moment, just the slow realization that every option now belongs to someone else, that sovereignty has become conditional, that pride is being financed at compound interest. The empire had crossed from borrowing to dependency, from dependency to exposure, and exposure invites intervention. Soon, the fiction of independence would be tested openly. And when it broke, it would not shatter. It would be calmly, bureaucratically dismantled. The breaking point did not arrive with panic in the streets or soldiers in the squares. It arrived quietly, almost politely, wrapped in official language and administrative calm. In 1875, the Ottoman Empire did what every overleveraged power eventually does. It admitted the truth. It could not pay, no cannon fired. No borders moved that day. But this was the moment the empire truly lost the war. It never realized it was fighting. A declaration of default is not just a financial event. It is a confession. It tells the world that your future revenues already belong to someone else. For the Ottomans, this was humiliation without spectacle. Years of denial collapsed into a single sentence. Payments would be suspended. Obligations unmet. Promises broken. And instantly, the balance of power shifted. The creditors did not rage. They did not threaten invasion. They did something far more dangerous. They organized. From London and Paris came a unified response, calm and surgical. If the empire could not manage its finances, others would manage them instead, not as occupiers, as administrators, as guardians of stability, as rational men cleaning up an Oriental mess. In Istanbul, the realization hit like cold water. This was no longer negotiation. This was submission disguised as cooperation. The empire had lost the right to fail on its own terms. Every source of revenue was now under scrutiny. Every coin accounted for before it could be spent. Think about the violence of that moment. An empire that once commanded tribute from others now had its own taxes examined by foreigners. Not through force, but through insopinozakidi popris briborgik. Not with threats, but with inevitability. This was the climax not because everything ended, but because something irreversible began. From this point forward, Ottoman sovereignty existed only where creditors allowed it. The empire still stood, but its spine had been quietly removed. Control, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself. It took the shape of offices, committees, and ledgers. In 1881, a new institution was imposed, with a name so dull it sounded harmless, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. No army marched behind it. No flag flew above its door. And yet this was the most effective occupying force the empire had ever faced. This body did not govern people. It governed revenue, salt taxes, tobacco monopolies, customs duties, stamp fees. The arteries of the Ottoman economy were quietly rerouted away from Istanbul and into a system designed to reassure foreign bondholders. Before the empire could spend a single coin on itself, its creditors were paid. Automatically, relentlessly. What made this conquest so devastating was its legality. Ottoman officials signed the documents. The Sultan approved the arrangements. On paper, nothing had been stolen. And that is precisely the point. Sovereignty was not taken. It was administered away. British and European representatives now sat inside the empire's financial machinery, making decisions that shaped daily life across provinces they would never visit. They did not need to rule. They only needed to collect. The state still existed, but it functioned like a shell, performing authority while its economic core answered to foreign logic. For ordinary people, the effects were brutal and impersonal. Higher prices, fewer services, a growing sense that the state no longer belonged to them. Resistance flared, but against whom? There was no visible enemy, only a system that always seemed to win. This was the triumph of soft conquest. No violence, no drama, just structure, process, permanence. The empire had not been conquered in battle. It had been converted into a revenue stream. And once an empire becomes a balance sheet, its fate is no longer decided by its people, but by those who own the debt. From that moment on, collapse was no longer a question of if, only of how slowly it would unfold. The empire continued to exist, but it moved like a body with its blood drained. Decisions were made, reforms announced, but every path forward ran through foreign approval. Political authority, without economic control, became theater. As the decades passed, the consequences multiplied. Provinces grew restless. Nationalist movements fed on the sense that Istanbul no longer protected its own. Crisis sak, the sta, lacked the resources to respond decisively. And when war came, as it always does, the empire entered it already weakened, already dependent, already compromised. What followed after the First World War was presented as the natural end of a dying empire. But the death had been engineered long before the battlefield. The carving up of the Middle East did not begin with secret wartime agreements. It began with debt schedules, customs controls, and financial supervision. Borders were drawn by men who had learned, decades earlier, how to rule without ruling. Britain did not need to colonize every inch of land to dominate the region. It had already shaped the economic logic that determined who could govern, who could borrow, and who would fail. Mandates and protectorates were merely the visible aftermath of a quieter, longer process. Look closely at the map that emerged from the ruins. Artificial lines, fragile states, economies designed around extraction and dependence. This was not accidental. It was the final expression of a system that had learned how to turn fiscal weakness into geopolitical advantage. The Ottoman Empire did not simply fall. It was dismantled, patiently and methodically, by mechanisms that left no ruins to photograph and no conqueror to curse, only consequences that would echo for generations. History prefers to disguise its most effective weapons. Cannons are obvious. Armies leave scars. Debt arrives quietly, dressed as assistance, and leaves behind a structure that outlives empires. The Ottoman story is uncomfortable because it refuses to stay in the past. It keeps pointing forward. Today the language has changed, but the logic remains intact. Development loans, stabilization packages, conditional aid. Nations are still told that sovereignty can be postponed, that control can be temporarily outsourced. that growth will eventually cancel obligation. You are told it is technical, neutral, unavoidable. Just numbers. Just policy. But remember what happened when an empire accepted that logic. It did not lose everything at once. It lost the right to choose. And once that right is gone, collapse becomes a formality. The tragedy of the Ottomans was not ignorance, it was belief. Belief that power could be preserved by appearances. That borrowing time was the same as buying strength. That modernity could be rented without cost. They learned too late that debt does not modernize nations. It disciplines them. So here's the question. History leaves behind unresolved and dangerous. When a state no longer controls its revenues, its currency, or its future decisions, is it still sovereign or merely administered? Empires do not always fall to enemies. Sometimes they sign themselves away, one agreement at a time, convinced they are choosing survival. And when the bill finally comes due, there is no dramatic moment. Only the quiet realization that the world you thought you owned was never really yours at all. If this feels familiar, it should. That is how you know the story is not over.